There are loves that drain you so slowly, you don't notice you're disappearing until one day you look in the mirror and wonder, who is that hollow-eyed woman staring back? You gave him your light, didn't you? Not once, not twice, but every single day, like a sun that never learned it was allowed to set. You poured your warmth into his cold spaces, believing that love meant making yourself smaller so he could feel bigger. You celebrated his victories as if they were oxygen, and when he succeeded, you felt worthy. When he stumbled, your world crumbled too. But here's what you didn't see then. Darling, you were never loving him. You were feeding a beautiful, hungry ghost. Every compliment you gave, every sacrifice you made, every time you swallowed your own needs to tend to his fragile ego, you were pouring water into a vessel with no bottom. He didn't love you back because he couldn't love anything real. He could only love reflections, mirrors, echoes of his own desperate need to feel important. You thought you were building something together, but you were the only one building. He was just taking the materials. Your energy became his confidence. Your devotion became his proof that he mattered. Your beautiful, generous heart became his personal validation machine, and you slowly forgot that you had needs too, dreams too, a voice too. You weren't difficult. You weren't asking for too much. You were just loving someone who had taught himself to mistake consumption for connection. And the saddest part, you probably knew, somewhere deep in your bones, that something was wrong. But love, real love, always hopes, always believes, always tries one more time. You didn't fail at loving, sweet woman. You succeeded so completely that you gave pieces of yourself to someone who couldn't even see you clearly enough to receive them. That wasn't love returning to you, that was emptiness, wearing love's beautiful mask. Do you remember when it started feeling like work? When loving him stopped being natural and became something you had to perfect, practice, rehearse? You began watching your words like a tightrope walker, measuring every gesture, calculating every response to keep his mood stable, his attention focused, his approval flowing your way. You learned his rhythms better than your own heartbeat. When he needed praise, when he needed space, when he needed you to disappear just enough so he could feel independent, but not so much that he felt ignored. You became fluent in the language of his ego, speaking it so perfectly that you forgot your own native tongue, the one that said what you actually felt, needed, wanted. Love became a performance where you were both the actress and the entire audience, applauding his every entrance while you remained backstage, adjusting the lights, fixing the costumes, making sure everything was perfect for his starring role. You convinced yourself this was devotion, but darling, devotion shouldn't require you to become invisible. You started editing yourself in real time. That joke that might overshadow him, swallowed. That accomplishment that might make him feel small, minimized. That moment of sadness that might burden him, hidden behind a smile that felt more like a mask each day. You became a supporting character in your own life story, and he never even noticed the script was all wrong. The most heartbreaking part wasn't that he took center stage, it was that you handed him the spotlight so willingly, believing that his happiness was more important than your authenticity. You thought you were being selfless, but you were actually disappearing, piece by piece, breath by breath, until loving him felt less like joy and more like holding your breath underwater, hoping you could last just a little longer. But here's what I need you to know. Real love doesn't require you to audition every day for the same role. Real love sees you when you're messy, celebrates you when you shine, and never asks you to shrink so someone else can grow. There was always something missing, wasn't there? Some bottomless need in him that no amount of your love could fill. Like trying to fill the ocean with a teacup, you kept pouring and pouring, and he kept needing and needing, and somehow you convinced yourself that if you just loved him better, smarter, more completely, It would finally be enough. But his hunger wasn't about you at all, sweet soul. It was about a wound so deep inside him that it had become his identity. He needed constant proof that he existed, that he mattered, that he was special not because you weren't giving enough, but because he had never learned to feed himself. You were trying to love someone back to life who had never really learned to live. Every morning you woke up to that familiar anxiety. How is his mood today? What does he need from me? How can I make sure he feels good about himself? You became a full-time emotional caretaker for a grown man who had somehow convinced you that his feelings were your responsibility. And when you couldn't fix his emptiness because, darling, no one can fill another person's void, you blamed yourself for not being enough. He collected your affection like tokens in a game he could never win, always needing just one more proof of love, one more confirmation of his worth. Your compliments became his daily bread, your attention became his oxygen, and your sacrifices became just, expected, normal. The baseline from which he measured whether you really cared. And you stopped noticing that you were hungry too. Hungry for reciprocal love, for genuine interest in your inner world, for someone who could hold space for your feelings without making it about themselves. You were so busy feeding his endless need for validation that you forgot you deserved to be nourished too. The cruelest part was how he made you believe this was what love looked like, this constant giving without receiving, this endless dance around his fragility, this life organized entirely around his emotional weather. The awakening doesn't come like lightning, does it? It comes like dawn slowly, then suddenly, until you can't unsee what you've been living with. Maybe it was the day he dismissed your pain because it inconvenienced his good mood. Maybe it was when you realized you'd stop talking about your dreams because they somehow always became about his fears. Maybe it was simply the morning you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. You started seeing the patterns like reading a map of your own disappearance. How conversations always circled back to him. How your successes were minimized, but your support of his was essential. How he could be devastatingly charming with others while treating your devotion as a given, something owed rather than gifted. The beautiful lie was this, that your love could heal his brokenness, that your consistency could teach him how to be present, that your selflessness could inspire his generosity. You believed that if you just loved him purely enough, completely enough, he would learn to see you, really see you, and love you back the same way. But narcissistic love isn't love that's broken, it's something else entirely wearing love's costume. It's the need to possess, to consume, to use another person's light to illuminate their own darkness. And the tragedy isn't that they can't love you back properly. The tragedy is that they can't love anything real at all, only reflections of what makes them feel good about themselves. You weren't loving a person, darling. You were loving a mirage, a beautiful projection of what you hoped was there beneath all that need. And now that you're beginning to see clearly, you might feel grief, not just for the relationship you've lost, but for the woman you became while trying to love someone who was never really there to receive it. This recognition hurts because it means admitting that all those moments you thought were building something were actually just feeding emptiness. But seeing clearly, even when it hurts, is the first step back to yourself. When you finally stopped trying, the quiet was deafening, wasn't it? All those years of orchestrating his happiness, managing his moods, anticipating his needs, and suddenly you just stopped. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful at first. It was terrifying. Because in that silence, you had to face how much of yourself you'd given away. The house felt different when you weren't constantly monitoring his emotional temperature. Your phone felt strange when you weren't crafting messages designed to boost his ego. Your own thoughts felt foreign because you'd spent so long thinking his thoughts, feeling his feelings, living his life alongside him, while yours gathered dust in the corners. In that silence, grief arrived. Not just grief for him, but grief for you, for all the dreams you'd postponed because his were more urgent, for all the friendships that had withered because you had no energy left after feeding his endless need for attention, for the woman you used to be before you learned to make yourself smaller to accommodate his largeness. You might have felt guilty at first for stopping the dance, for refusing to be his emotional supply anymore. Part of you probably still wondered if you were being selfish, if you were giving up too easily. That voice in your head, his voice, really whispering that you were being dramatic, ungrateful, too sensitive. But here's what the silence taught you. Your worth was never dependent on how well you could meet someone else's bottomless needs. Your value was never measured by how completely you could disappear into another person's life. Your love was never meant to be a one-way river flowing endlessly towards someone who would never think to ask about the source. The silence after narcissistic love feels like grief, because it is grief. You're mourning the woman who tried so hard to love someone back to wholeness that she forgot wholeness was something she already possessed. You're grieving the time spent, the energy given, the beautiful heart that poured itself out for someone who never learned to pour back. But in this silence, something else is happening too. Something beautiful and necessary. You're remembering what your own voice sounds like. Who were you before you became his mirror? Can you remember her? She's still there, beneath all the layers of accommodation and self-erasure. She's been waiting patiently for you to come back, like a faithful friend who never gave up hope that you'd remember your way home. Finding yourself after narcissistic love feels like archaeology. You have to dig through years of what would make him happy to uncover what makes me happy. You have to brush away the dust from dreams you abandoned because they threatened his sense of being the center of the universe. You have to remember what you actually think about things, not what you learned to think to keep peace. It's strange, isn't it? How you can live with someone for years and still feel completely unknown. How you can share a bed, a home, a life with someone who never once asked about your inner world with genuine curiosity. You became so skilled at reading his emotions that you forgot you had your own. So practiced at managing his reactions that you stopped having authentic responses. But here's what I want you to know, darling. You didn't lose yourself completely. You can't. The essence of who you are, that core of light, creativity, wisdom, humor, strength, it never disappeared. It just went underground, like bulbs waiting for spring. And now, in this dark time after leaving him, those buried parts of you are beginning to stir again. You might feel guilty for wanting things he would have found threatening. You might feel selfish for taking up space he would have needed to fill. You might feel afraid that choosing yourself means you're becoming like him, narcissistic, self-centered. But that fear is just another echo of his voice, trying to keep you small even in his absence. Reclaiming yourself isn't narcissistic. It's necessary. It's the difference between healthy self-love and pathological self-obsession. You're not trying to use others to validate your worth. You're trying to remember that your worth exists independently of anyone else's opinion of it. This darkness you're in, it's not punishment. It's incubation. You're not falling apart. You're remembering how to be whole. Imagine if you'd spent years tending someone else's garden while your own lay fallow. All that care, all that attention, all that nurturing energy poured into soil that could never bloom because it wasn't really soil at all, just an endless, hungry void dressed up to look like fertile ground. Your garden, your dreams, your passions, your relationships, your creative spirit has been waiting for you, not accusingly, not bitterly, but with the patient grace of perennials that trust in seasons, that no winter always gives way to spring. What grows there? What did you love before you learned to love so carefully, so strategically, so completely around someone else's needs? Maybe it's painting again, or reading without interruption, or having conversations with friends that aren't practice sessions for managing his moods. Maybe it's silence that doesn't need to be filled, or joy that doesn't need to be justified, or sadness that's allowed to exist without being fixed immediately. Your garden might look wild at first after years of neglect. The boundaries might be unclear, the paths overgrown. You might not remember what you planted there or trust that anything beautiful can still grow. But gardens have memory, darling. The roots remember, the soil remembers, and slowly, gently, with your attention turned back to your own ground, life begins again. You start small. Maybe it's just watering one forgotten corner, saying no to something you don't want to do, or yes to something that brings you joy. Maybe it's pulling weeds, recognizing thoughts that aren't really yours, habits that served his needs but never served you. Maybe it's simply sitting quietly in your own space and remembering that you deserve to bloom. The most beautiful thing about reclaiming your garden is discovering what wants to grow there naturally, without force, without performance, without constant vigilance. When you stop trying to be the perfect flower in someone else's arrangement, you remember what kind of garden your soul actually wants to be. Some days it will feel overwhelming, this vast space of possibility. But other days, you'll catch yourself humming while you tend it, and you'll remember, this is what contentment feels like when it doesn't depend on someone else's mood. The fear comes quietly at first, doesn't it? The worry that if you love someone again, you'll disappear again. That your generous heart, the same heart that gave so completely to someone who couldn't receive it, will betray you once more, leading you back into the familiar dance of self-erasure disguised as devotion. But here's what you're learning now, slowly and gently. There's a difference between loving someone and losing yourself in them. The difference isn't in how much you care, but in how you care. It's not about loving less, it's about loving differently. With boundaries instead of abandon, with presence instead of sacrifice. You're discovering that real love doesn't require you to become smaller. It doesn't ask you to edit your truth or minimize your light to make room for someone else's insecurity. Healthy love celebrates your fullness, your complexity, your beautiful contradictions. It doesn't need you to be perfect, it needs you to be real. When you were with him, you thought love meant anticipating every need, preventing every disappointment, becoming whatever he needed you to be in each moment. But that wasn't love, that was survival. You were trying to love your way out of emotional danger, and love was never meant to be a strategy for safety. Now you're learning that love can be both gentle and boundaried, both generous and self-preserving. You can care deeply about someone's well-being without making their feelings your responsibility. You can offer support without losing your center. You can be present for someone's struggles without drowning in them. This new way of loving might feel selfish at first because you're so used to love meaning self-sacrifice. But what you're discovering is revolutionary. When you stay connected to yourself while loving others, your love becomes more authentic, not less. More nourishing, not more depleting. More sustainable, not more dramatic. You're not becoming cold or guarded, you're becoming wise. You're learning that the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for others is to love from a full cup instead of an empty one. From strength instead of desperation. From choice instead of compulsion. There's a particular kind of strength that only grows in quiet spaces, away from the noise of someone else's needs, drowning out your own voice. It's not the strength you developed while with him that was endurance, resilience, the ability to keep giving when you had nothing left. This is different. This is the strength of a woman who has learned to be her own good company. You're discovering that solitude isn't punishment after narcissistic love, it's medicine. After years of living at the mercy of someone else's emotional weather, you're finally experiencing the peace of your own climate. Your mood doesn't shift with someone else's approval anymore. Your day doesn't succeed or fail based on whether you've adequately fed someone else's ego. In this solitude, you're meeting parts of yourself you'd forgotten existed. The part that has opinions without checking if they'll cause problems. The part that makes decisions based on what feels right for you, not what will keep someone else happy. The part that can sit with difficult emotions without immediately trying to fix or change them to spare someone else's discomfort. This strength isn't loud or aggressive, it's quiet and deep, like roots growing down into rich soil. It's the strength to say no without elaborate explanations, to say yes without asking permission, to take up space without apologizing. It's the strength to feel your feelings fully without making them anyone else's responsibility to fix or validate. You're learning that you don't need someone else to complete you, not because you're somehow deficient on your own, but because wholeness was always yours to claim. You don't need external validation to know your worth, external drama to feel alive, or external problems to solve to feel useful. The woman you're becoming in this solitude isn't harder or colder than who you were before. She's simply more rooted, more centered, more aware of where she ends and others begin. She knows the difference between intimacy and enmeshment, between love and dependency, between caring and caretaking. This strength will serve you well, whether you choose partnership again or choose to remain contentedly alone. Because now you know, your happiness isn't hostage to anyone else's emotional state. Here you are, darling. After the storm, after the recognition, after the grief and the silence, and the slow, patient work of remembering who you are, here you are, coming home to your own heart. And what a beautiful homecoming this is. You understand now that the love you poured so freely into that empty vessel was never wasted. It was practice for this moment, when you finally turn that same generous, devoted attention toward yourself. All that capacity for seeing beauty, for nurturing growth, for believing in potential, it belongs to you first. Your heart isn't broken, even though it was bruised. Your capacity for love isn't damaged, even though it was misused. Your intuition isn't faulty, even though you learned to doubt it. You simply loved someone who couldn't love you back. And that says everything about his limitations and nothing about your worth. You're different now than when this journey began. Not because you've become less loving, but because you've become more discerning. Not because you've closed your heart, but because you've learned to love it wisely. Not because you've stopped believing in connection, but because you now know the difference between true intimacy and emotional consumption. The peace you feel now isn't the absence of feeling, it's the presence of self-love. It's waking up without dread about someone else's mood. It's making coffee the way you like it without worrying if someone else will approve. It's choosing your clothes, your friends, your activities based on what brings you joy, not what will keep someone else stable. This is what it means to come home to yourself, knowing that you are both the lover and the beloved, the nurturer and the one who deserves nurturing, the one who sees beauty and the one who is beautiful to behold. You don't need to be perfect to deserve love. You don't need to be constantly giving to be worthy of receiving. You don't need to make yourself smaller to make room for someone else's greatness. You are enough. You have always been enough. And now, finally, you know it. Welcome home, beautiful woman. Welcome home,